the back room of Doone's Horse Repository on Ship Street in Dublin, where the ink froze in the well on cold mornings and the smell of wet straw came up through the floorboards from the standings below, a young woman named Honora Slaney copied pedigrees for 11 shillings a week. She had been doing it for 4 years and 2 months. She sat on a high stool at a sloped desk under a window of small green panes, and she wrote in a hand so clear and so even that gentlemen who had never once asked her name asked for the Slaney copy by name, and paid extra for it, and never knew whose fingers had made it. Her hand was the best in Dublin. Her father had taught it to her at a kitchen table in Kilmainham when she was 7 years old, with a goose quill cut short and a jar of oak gall ink, and he had told her a thing she had never forgotten, which was that a pedigree is not a decoration. It is a promise, he said. Somebody made it and somebody keeps it, and if it is a lie, then everything built on top of it is a lie as well, all the way up to the king's plate. She was 24 that March. She wore a gray stuff gown that had been turned once and would not survive a second turning, and a shawl the color of weak tea, and her chestnut hair was parted plainly in the center and pinned low at the nape because that was the cheapest way to keep it out of the ink. She had steady hazel eyes and fair skin freckled across the nose from a childhood spent on the Curragh, and she was not thought pretty by the clerks in the front office, chiefly because she never once looked at any of them long enough to give them the chance to decide. She copied. She had copied the entire produce of 9 Irish studs that winter, and she could have recited any of it in the dark. That was the thing about Honora Slaney that nobody at Doones understood, because nobody at Doones had ever thought to ask. She did not merely write blood down. She held it. She could look at a column of names and see, behind it, a gray mare's shoulder and a chestnut's crooked blaze, and a filly foal that had died of the joint ill in the wet spring of 1809, and she could tell you which side of the family the weak forelegs came down, and which side gave the deep girth and the honest lungs. She had learned it the way other children learn the names of saints. Her father had been Denis Slaney, and there was a time when that name was said with respect, from Cork to Newmarket. He was a bloodstock agent and a compiler of stud books, a small brown weathered man with beautiful manners and no money, and he had made himself indispensable to half the breeders in Leinster because he alone kept a record they could trust. He had walked mares up and down the whole eastern half of the country. He had sat up in strange barns with a lantern and a notebook while a mare foaled, and written down the hour and the markings and the color before he would allow himself to sleep, because a foal's markings at birth are the only honest signature a horse ever gives. Then in the spring of 1811, when Honora was 16, the stewards of the Turf Club had struck a pedigree out of the book, and the pedigree they struck was one that Denis Slaney had sworn to, and after that his name was said in a different way entirely. The mare was a grey called Moonwater. That was all. One grey mare, foaled in 1804, and a question of where she had been covered in the April of 1807, and whether the horse who covered her was the horse Denis Slaney said had covered her. A gentleman of County Kildare named Sir Hesketh Nangle had sworn on his honour that the mare had never left his yard that spring, that she could not have been at Rathmoyne on the 14th of April, and that Denis Slaney's book was therefore a fabrication got up to sell blood that did not exist. Sir Hesketh Nangle was a baronet with 11,000 acres and a seat in the Kildare Street Club. Denis Slaney was a small brown man with a notebook. It did not take the stewards very long. They struck out Moonwater and every one of her descendants, past and future. And they wrote in the minute book that the entry had been made without sufficient authority, And the phrase, without sufficient authority, followed Denis Slaney like a smell for the rest of his life. He did not stop working. That was the part Honora could not think about, even now, without her breath going short. He went on writing his book, alone, correcting and cross-checking and writing letters to men who did not answer, for 3 more years, until the winter of 1814 took him in a room in Coombe Street, with the notebook still open on the bed. He had been 49. She had sold his boots and his good coat and his silver pencil case to bury him, and she had kept the books, all 11 of them, tied in a bundle with a leather strap, and she had them still, under her bed in Mrs. Fagan's lodging house in Golden Lane, and there was not one day in 4 years that she had not put her hand on that strap before she slept. So she copied pedigrees, and she was careful never to say her surname aloud where the gentleman could hear it, because she had learned what happened when she did. It happened on a Thursday, in fact, on the 2nd Thursday in March, in the yard at Dunes, on a raw morning with the sky the color of dishwater and 40 horses standing under the arcade waiting for the sale. She had been sent out with a corrected sheet for the auctioneer's rostrum. 3 gentlemen stood by the pillar with their hats tipped back, looking at a bay 4-year-old, and one of them was saying that the horse was well enough but that he would want to see the breeding. And another said the breeding was written on the card, and the first one laughed and said, "Written by whom, though? That is always the question in this country." And the third said, mildly, "Well, if it was written by a Slaney, you may as well use it to light your pipe." They all laughed. It was not cruelty of the great and dramatic kind. It was small and easy and unthinking, the way a man kicks a stone out of a path, and it went into her like a needle going into a thumb. She walked past them with the sheet in her hand and her face perfectly still, and she gave the sheet to Mr. Doone, and she went back up the stairs to the little room with the green panes and sat down on the high stool and picked up the quill and did not weep, because she had decided at 17 that she was not going to spend her life doing that. She had a plan instead, and the plan was patient and slow and very nearly hopeless, and it consisted of this. She was assembling, in the margins and on the backs of spoiled sheets and in a 4th notebook of her own, every scrap of evidence that could still be found about a gray mare called Moonwater, foaled 1804, and where that mare had stood in the April of 1807. She had been at it for 3 years. She had the names of 2 ferrymen and 1 farrier, and a veterinary surgeon who might still be alive at Athey, and she had a memory of her father saying, once, near the end, that Barnaby Vesey knew, and that Barnaby Vesey would say so one day when he had the courage. Barnaby Vesey was the master of Rathmoyne. Rathmoyne was a breeding stud on the flat green land west of the Curragh, where the Liffey water runs shallow over gravel, 61 mares in it at the last count she had copied, and an old stallion named Cold Harbour, and 1,100 acres of the best limestone grass in Ireland. And in all her 24 years, Honora Slaney had never set foot on it. Barnaby Vesey had never written to her father, not once, in 3 years, while the man went down. She had told herself she did not hate him. She was not certain it was true. On the 4th Thursday in March, a letter came to Dunes addressed to Miss Honora Slaney, in a hand that shook so badly the clerk had to hold it sideways to read the direction. And it had been franked at Nos, and inside it there were 4 lines. "Miss Slaney," it said, "I am dying, which the doctor will not say to me, but the priest will. There is a thing I should have said in 1811 and did not. Come to Rathmoyne, and come this week, because I do not think I have another. Barnaby Vesey." She read it 3 times, standing at the foot of the stairs with the cold coming in under the door. Then she went up and finished the sheet she was copying, because she had been paid for it. And she squared the edges of the pile and stoppered the ink and put on the shawl the color of weak tea. She told Mr. Doone she required 4 days. Mr. Doone said that if she took 4 days, she need not trouble to come back at all, there being 9 girls in Dublin who could hold a pen. And she said, quietly, "No, there are not, Mr. Doone. There is one, and you have had her for 11 shillings a week for 4 years and 2 months. Then she walked out through the arcade past 40 horses standing in the wet and did not look back, and by 3 o'clock that afternoon she was on the Naas Mail with her father's 11 notebooks in a canvas bag on her knees and every penny she had in the world, which was £2.6, sewn into the hem of her petticoat. The mail put her down at Naas at 8 in the evening, and a carter going west took her the last 7 miles for 4pence and no conversation, and so she came to Rathmoyne in the rain, in the dark, on the box of a turf cart, with the smell of the country coming at her out of the blackness like something she had been holding her breath against for 8 years. Wet limestone grass. Wet whitehorn. Horses, there is no smell on this earth like 50 horses in a wet field at night, warm and grassy and faintly sweet. And Honora Slaney sat on the box of that cart with her father's notebooks against her chest and found that her eyes were running and that it had nothing whatever to do with the rain. The gates were open. There was no lodge-keeper. The avenue went up between 2 ranks of beech trees for a quarter of a mile, and then the land opened out on both sides into paddocks with post and rail fences. White once, gray now, and out in the dark on her right something moved and blew softly through its nose, and she turned her head and could just make out, against the last gray light in the western sky, the pale shape of a gray mare standing at the rail with her head over it, watching the cart go by. She would learn the mare's name within the hour. Silver Ash, 11 years old, foaled at Rathmoyne in the spring of 1808 out of a gray mare called Moonwater, and Honora Slaney had written that name 10,000 times in her life and had never once seen the animal it belonged to. The house was long and low and plain, a farmhouse that had been added to twice by men with more horses than vanity, 3 stories in the middle and 2 at the ends, whitewashed, with a fanlight over the door and a lamp burning behind it. A woman opened before Honora had finished climbing the steps. She was perhaps 50, square and brisk, with iron-colored hair under a white cap and a face that had spent a great deal of its life outdoors, and she looked at Honora for a long moment in the light of the lamp she was holding up. Then she said, "Well, God forgive us all. You have the very set of his shoulders. Come in out of that." Her name was Una Bracken, and she had kept the house at Rathmoyne for 19 years. She took the wet shawl off Honora as if Honora were a child, and put her in front of a turf fire in a stone-flagged kitchen with a scrubbed deal table 12 feet long, and gave her a bowl of mutton broth and a heel of soda bread, and stood over her until she ate it. Only then did she say, "He has been asking every hour since Tuesday. He is very bad. Will you go up?" Honora said yes. On the stairs she passed an old man coming down with an empty basin, a small bent man with white hair growing out of his ears and hands like knotted rope, and he stopped dead on the half landing and stared at her, and his mouth moved twice before anything came out of it, and what came out was, "Denise," she said, "I am his daughter." And the old man, whose name was Fergus Dolan, and who had been traveling head lad at Rathmoyne for 41 years, sat down heavily on the stairs with the basin in his lap, and put one rope-knuckled hand over his eyes and said, Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. I thought I would go into the ground with it. Barnaby Vesey was 78 years old, and he was dying of a growth in his stomach, and he had been a big man once, and was now a yellow arrangement of bones in a nightshirt propped on 4 pillows in a room that smelled of laudanum and burnt turf. The window was open 2 inches at the top, because he had insisted on it. He wanted to hear the yard. When Honora came in, he turned his head on the pillow with enormous care, the way a man turns a full glass, and he looked at her, and he said, in a voice like paper, "You are very like him about the eyes." She stood at the foot of the bed with her hands folded because she did not trust herself to come closer. She said, "You wrote that there was a thing you should have said in 1811. He said, "There was. And I will say it now to you and then to a lawyer, in that order, because I am a coward and I want to say it once to somebody who will not write it down. The mayor was here. She said nothing at all. He said, Moonwater came in on the 12th of April in the year 7, walked from Nangles by his own man, and she was covered by my horse Portreeve on the 14th and again on the 16th. And I stood in the covering yard and watched it done with my own 2 eyes, and your father wrote it in my book at my own table with my own ink. And when they took him before the stewards in the year 11, and Hesketh Nangle stood up and swore that Mayor never left his yard that spring, I was in the room. I was in the room, Miss Slaney, and I said nothing, because Nangle held 1,100 pounds of my paper, and because I was 66 years of age and afraid, and because the whole trade would have had to choose between a baronet and a horse dealer's book, and I knew which way they would choose. And I have thought about it every day for 8 years, and the last 4 of them your father was in the ground. He stopped. His breath was going in and out of him like wind under a door. She found that she had come round the side of the bed without deciding to. She said, "Why is there a mare called Silver Ash standing in your front paddock?" He almost laughed. It hurt him, and he did it anyway. He said, "Because I kept the line. Because I could not say the word in a room full of men, but I could keep the blood. And I kept every filly out of that mare and every filly out of those fillies for 8 years. And they are all out there in the dark. And not one of them is in the book. And not one of them is worth 2 to any buyer in England. And they are the best bred horses in this country." He turned his head again. He said, "I am giving them to you." There was a silence in which she could hear a horse cough somewhere out in the wet. She said, "And what am I to do with them?" He said, "Prove it." And then, after a while, "And God help you, because I could not." Barnaby Vesey lived 4 days more. She sat with him for most of them. He was lucid perhaps a third of the time, and in that third he talked about horses. Only horses. And Honora took down what he said in pencil on the backs of her father's spoiled sheets, because she had understood by the second day that this old dying man's memory was a document, and that when he stopped breathing it would be gone. He gave her the covering dates of 1804 to 1809 out of his head with the weather. He told her that Ambrose Keeley, the veterinary surgeon, was still alive at Athy in 81 and had every day book he ever kept, because his wife would not let him burn anything. He told her that the ferry at Ballymore Eustace kept a book of every led horse crossed and charged, and that the ferryman's son had the books. He told her on the last morning, with his eyes shut, that the yearling colt he had sold out of Silver Ash in 1815 for 40 guineas to a jobber going to Liverpool was the best horse he ever bred, and that he had let him go for the price of a heifer, because the pedigree could not be written. He said, I do not know what became of him. Say a prayer for that horse. He was a big, raw, ugly, gentle thing, and he had a head on him like a hammer, and he could gallop until Tuesday. He died at 4:20 on the morning of the 3rd of April, 1819, with the window open 2 inches and the yard beginning to stir below it, and Honora Slaney closed his eyes with her thumbs, and then went downstairs and out into the gray light and stood in the middle of the covering yard and looked at the buildings and had absolutely no idea what was to become of her. The funeral was on the Tuesday. There were 140 people at it, which surprised her, and 11 of them were breeders of note, and not one of them spoke to her. She stood at the back of the church at Clonamore in her turned gray gown between Mrs. Bracken and Fergus Dolan, and heard herself described by 2 ladies in the pew in front as the Dublin person, in the tone one uses for a smell. Afterwards they went back to the house, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon Mr. Eustace Prendergast, attorney, of Naas, a dry, precise man with spectacles pushed up into his hair and a green baize bag, laid the will of Barnaby Vesey on the long table in the Rathmoyne dining room and read it aloud to 19 people. Honora was made to sit at the end of the table. She did not know why until afterwards. There were 3 cousins of the deceased from Carlow present, and an archdeacon, and Sir Hesketh Nangle himself in a beautiful bottle green coat with his hat on his knee, and Mr. Gideon Thrale, who was agent and man of business to the Duke of Kilcarrig, and who took a chair by the window with the air of a man attending something that need not detain him long. Mr. Prendergast cleared his throat and began, and the small bequests took 11 minutes, and Honora watched the rain go across the paddocks in long gray combs, and thought about a raw, ugly colt with a head like a hammer somewhere in England. And then Mr. Prendergast said her name, and she came back into the room with a jolt like a dropped bucket. "I give and devise," said Mr. Prendergast, "all that and those the lands of Rathmoyne and Clonamore in the barony of Naas South and county of Kildare, containing 1,112 acres or thereabouts, together with the mansion house, offices, covering yard, boxes, barns, and all appurtenances thereto, and together with the whole of my live stock of horses standing thereon, being at the date here of 61 brood mares, the stallion known as Cold Harbour, and all foals, yearlings and young stock whatsoever, and together with my stud books, covering books, day books, ledgers, and all papers of every description, unto Honora Slaney, spinster, daughter of the late Denis Slaney of Dublin, bloodstock agent, absolutely and for her own sole and separate use. It is remarkable how quiet 19 people can be. Honora heard the fire settle. She heard a horse out in the yard strike a shoe against the cobbles twice, and a jackdaw on the chimney, and Mr. Thrale by the window recross his legs. One of the Carlow cousins said, "I beg your pardon," and Mr. Prendergast did not look up, but said, "I shall read it a second time at the end, if it is desired," and read on. "And I direct," he said, "that the said Honora Slaney shall be styled mistress of Rathmoyne, and that no person shall buy, sell, cover, geld, move, or destroy any horse upon the said lands save by her direction in writing." Sir Hesketh Nangle laughed. It was a short laugh, one syllable entirely involuntary, and he covered it with his hand at once and looked at the ceiling as though the joke had come from up there. Honora looked at him for the first time. He was a heavy, handsome man of about 60, with a high color and white hair curling over his ears and small, deep-set eyes the color of wet flint. And she thought, with a calm that frightened her a little, "I have imagined your face for 8 years, and I had it almost exactly right." Mr. Prendergast turned a page, and whereas, he said, "I hold and stand possessed of certain mortgages and charges upon the lands of Kilcarrig, Ballinderry, and Dunmoylan in the said county, being the estate of his Grace Adair Farrand, 6th Duke of Kilcarrick, in the principal sum of £11,400, with arrears of interest amounting at this date to £980. Now I do hereby release, discharge, and extinguish the whole of the said principal and arrears, and I direct my executors to deliver up the said securities cancelled, upon and subject only to the following condition. Mr. Gideon Thrale stopped recrossing his legs. That the said Duke of Kilcarrig, said Mr. Prendergast, shall accept and shall faithfully discharge the office of Master of the Rathmoyne Stud for the term of 7 years from the date of my death, residing within 10 miles thereof, attending personally to the covering season, the foaling, the breaking, and the sales, and being in all matters of breeding, purchase, sale, and management subject to the direction of the mistress of Rathmoyne aforesaid, at a salary of £100 by the year. And if he shall decline the said office, or having accepted shall abandon it, then the whole of the said principal sum and arrears shall become due and payable within 90 days, and my executors shall levy the same to the uttermost farthing. It was not quiet after that. The Archdeacon said good heavens twice. One of the Carlow cousins stood up and sat down again. Mr. Thrale came away from the window and said, in a smooth, carrying voice, Mr. Prendergast, I take it you are aware that an attempt to place a peer of the realm in domestic service is void as against public policy. And Mr. Prendergast said, without heat, it is not service, sir. It is an office with a salary, and there is nothing in law or in heaven to prevent a gentleman managing a stud farm. And I may say that his late Grace's grandfather managed 3. And there is a further clause, he said, if I may finish. There was, and it was the dullest thing in the document, and Honora afterwards thought that this was probably deliberate, because Barnaby Vesey had been a coward, but he had not been a fool. And I direct, said Mr. Prendergast, that during the said term of 7 years the produce of every mare covered at Rathmoyne by the Rathmoyne horse shall be entered in the Rathmoyne register, and shall stand to the account of the mistress of Rathmoyne, save only where the fee for such covering has been paid in money at the time of service, and a receipt for the same entered in the said register over the signature of the mistress or her deputy. And I direct that no fee shall be forgiven, deferred, taken in kind, or entered on credit, and that any covering not so receipted shall be deemed a covering upon the account of Rathmoyne, and the produce thereof the absolute property of the mistress thereof. Nobody said anything about that clause at all. Mr. Thrale, in fact, looked faintly relieved, the way a man does when a document turns out to be about bookkeeping. He made a small note in a pocketbook, and Honora, who had been trained from the age of 7 to hear the precise thing a document was really saying, made a small note in the only place she had, which was her memory, and kept her face empty. Afterwards, in the hall, while the cousins put on their coats and the Archdeacon said what a very singular arrangement, Sir Hesketh Nangle came and stood in front of her. He was a foot taller than she was, and he smelled of bay rum. He said, pleasantly, Miss Slaney, is it? She said, it is. He said, I knew your father. She said, I know you did. He looked at her for a moment, with the small flint-colored eyes, and something went across the back of them. And then he smiled, a wide social smile, and said, this place will eat you. It is 1,100 acres and 61 mares, and a wage bill of 400 a year, and it has not shown a profit since the year 12. And you have not 1 shilling of capital. And in 18 months you will be selling, and when you sell you will come to me, because there is nobody else within 40 miles who can write the cheque. And I shall be very fair with you, he said. Very fair indeed. She said, thank you, Sir Hesketh, and stood there until he went away. And only when the door had shut behind him did she discover that she had driven her thumbnail through the seam of her glove. That night she could not sleep, and so she went out. There was a 3/4 moon, and the wet had cleared, and the whole flat green country lay silver and black under it, and Honora Slaney walked out of the house in her boots, with a shawl over her nightgown and a stable lantern she had not lit, and went along the rails of the front paddock. She did not know the horses. She did not know one of them. She stood at the rail, and a dozen shapes came up out of the field towards her in the moonlight, unhurried, curious, breathing, and stood along the rail on the other side, blowing warm grass-smelling air at her, and one of them was gray and old, and lifted her head and put her long, bony face over the top rail and left it there, 6 inches from Honora's cheek, and did not move. Honora put up her hand very slowly and laid it flat on the mare's cheekbone. She said, out loud in the dark, to a horse, "Well, so you are her daughter." And then, because there was nobody within a 1/4 of a mile to hear it, and because she had been holding it since she was 16 years of age, she put her forehead against the wet gray face of Silver Ash and cried until her legs shook. She was up at 5. That was the beginning of it. And she never afterwards remembered deciding anything. She simply began. She got a lantern and a ledger and a lead pencil, and she started at the top of the yard at the first box on the left. And by 9:30 that morning, when Fergus Dolan found her, she had written down 41 horses, with their color, their sex, their age, as far as anyone knew it, the state of their feet, every white marking on every leg, and every whorl of hair on every neck and forehead, which is the thing her father had taught her before he taught her to write. Fergus Dolan looked at what she had done and took his hat off, which she did not understand until much later. He said, "Miss, what is it you are at?" She said, "I am counting my horses." He said, "There is nobody counted the horses on this place in 9 years." She said, "I know. I have been reading the returns since I was 20, and they do not add. There are 11 mares in the 1816 return that are not in the 1817 return, and there is no sale and no death entered for any of them, and I want to know where 11 horses went." Fergus Dolan looked at the ground for a while. Then he said, "You had best count them all so, and do it before His Grace comes." She said, "And when does His Grace come?" Fergus Dolan looked past her at the avenue, where a horse was coming up through the beeches at a hard, flat gallop with the mud going up off it in sheets, and he said, "Now." He came into the yard too fast and pulled up hard, and the black horse under him slid 4 feet on the wet cobbles and stood with its head down, blowing like a bellows, and the man came off it before it had properly stopped. Honora had expected a duke. She had a picture ready, assembled out of 8 years of copying pedigrees for gentlemen who never came further than the rostrum, and it involved a carriage and a valet and pale hands. What got off the black horse was a man of about 33, 6'2", with the shoulders of somebody who had spent his life pulling on things that did not want to come, in a dark green riding coat splashed to the collar with mud, and a buff waistcoat, and a plain white shirt with no cravat at all, buckskin breeches and tall black boots with the mud dried gray on them, and he had dark hair cut short and blown every way, and a hard, handsome, weather-browned face with a straight nose and a clean-shaven square jaw, and dark gray eyes that went round that yard once, quickly, the way a man looks at a room he has been in 1,000 times, and stopped on her. He said, "Are you her?" Honora said, "If you mean am I Miss Slaney, I am. He threw the reins at nobody in particular, and Fergus Dolan caught them. He came across the cobbles and stopped about 4 feet away, and she had to tip her head back to look at him, and she did it, and kept doing it. He said, "Do you know what has been done to me?" She said, "I heard it read yesterday at 4 o'clock, the same as you." He said, "I was not there. Mr. Thrale was there, and Mr. Thrale wrote to me at 2 o'clock this morning, and I have ridden from Dunmoylan since it was dark." She said, "Then you know it better than I do, because I have not had a copy." There was a silence. A pigeon came down off the clock arch. He said, in a voice that was quite level and much worse than shouting, "Miss Slaney, I am the 6th Duke of Kilkerrig. There have been Farrens at Kilkerrig since 1642. I have 11,000 acres, of which 9,000 are bog and mountain, and I have 410 tenants, and I have a house with a hole in the roof of the long gallery that I have not been able to mend since my father died, and I owe £11,400. And until yesterday afternoon, I owed it to a man who was decent enough to be dying. And now, if I do not spend 7 years taking orders about horses from a young woman who copies pedigrees in Dublin for 11 shillings a week, that debt falls in within 90 days, and my tenants go on the road. She said, "I do not copy pedigrees in Dublin any more." It was not the answer he had expected, and it landed slightly sideways, and she saw it land. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "How many mares are on this farm?" She said 61 at the last written return. "But the return is wrong." He said, "Of course it is wrong." He turned and walked away from her towards the covering yard, and over his shoulder, in a voice that was not for her, he said, "I shall want 2 days. Mr. Thrale is coming down." He came the following afternoon, Mr. Gideon Thrale, in a chaise, a spare grey man of 50 in black, with a tight small mouth and hands he was for ever washing in the air in front of him, and he brought with him a lady. The lady was the Honourable Vivienne Estridge, and she was the daughter of an English earl with a bank behind him, and she was 26, and beautiful in the manner of a good drawing, and she came into the hall at Rathmoyne in a pelisse of cherry-coloured merino, with sable at the throat, and looked around her at the flagged floor and the whip-rack and the smell of turf smoke, and said, "Oh, Adair." It was the first time Honora heard anyone use his name. What happened next happened because of the way Rathmoyne was built. The office was a small room off the covering yard with a hatch through to the tack room, and the hatch had a wooden shutter that had been broken since before Honora was born. And if you stood at the standing desk in the office with the ledgers, you could hear every syllable spoken in the tack room, because that is what such a hatch is for. It is so a man in the office can hear his own yard. She was at that desk at 7 in the evening with the 1816 returns and a candle, doing what she had told Fergus Dolan she was doing, which was looking for 11 horses. They came into the tack room. They did not look through the hatch, because nobody looks through a hatch. Thrale said, "I have been through the whole of it with counsel this morning, and the plain fact is that the condition is enforceable, and if you decline, they will levy." He said, "But there is another road, your grace, and it is much the shorter one. Take the office, take it publicly, with a very good grace. Serve 1 season, and in the meantime, the girl will do what such a person always does, which is fail. And when she fails, she will sell, and Sir Hesketh will buy, and the covenant dies with the stud, and you are free with your debt gone, and Rathmoyne next door in friendly hands." And then the lady said, "But Adair, Will you not have to be seen to do it? And he said, Yes, and I shall be seen to do it. And it will be all over the Kildare Street Club by Saturday. And there will be a caricature of me in a print shop window in Dublin inside a month with a curry comb in my hand. And the lady laughed and said, Poor love, and then said, Tell me truly, is she quite dreadful? There was a pause of about 2 seconds. Honora stood at the standing desk with the pencil in her fingers and the candle burning quietly and did not move at all. He said, She is a copying clerk. She said, Is she pretty? He said, She is not anything. She is a small brown thing in a gray gown who stands in a yard riding down horses she has never seen, as though the riding were the point of it. She cannot tell a mare in foal from a fat pony. Give her 1 season. She will sell the lot at Ballsbridge in the spring for the price of a carriage and go back to her ink, and God knows I shall not stop her. And then Mr. Thrale said, And there is the father, of course. And the Duke said, Yes, there is the father. Nangle broke him in the year 11 for writing a pedigree that was not there. It is not a thing one likes to say, but it is in the blood. And I am to have my breeding directed for 7 years by a woman whose father sold a lie to half of England. And the lady said, Poor, poor love. And the 3 of them went out of the tack room, and the sound of them crossing the cobbles went away, and Honora Slaney stood at the standing desk for a very long time. She noticed, distantly, that the candle wanted trimming. She trimmed it. She noticed that her hand was steady, and that this seemed important, and she went on standing there, and inside her something enormous and quiet was happening which she could not have described at the time, and which she understood perfectly well 11 months later. It was not grief. She had had all the grief there was in the year 14, and there was none left in the barrel. It was not even anger, exactly, though the anger was there, folded down small and put away where she could find it. What it was the end of a question. She had come up the avenue on the box of a turf cart with a bag of notebooks, wondering whether she was permitted to want anything, and she had spent a week being looked at by Carlo cousins and archdeacons, and she had been within an inch of understanding herself as a person to whom a strange thing had happened by accident, and a man had just settled it in 19 words. She is not anything. She picked up the pencil. She turned back the page of the 1816 return, and she wrote, in the margin, in that hand for which gentlemen paid extra, 11 mares unaccounted between the returns of 16 and 17. Query, and under it she wrote, Query the fee book against the covering book for the same years. And then, on a fresh page, at the top, she wrote a heading. And the heading was the Rathmoyne Register, and under it made this 5th day of April, 1800 AD 19, by Honora Slaney, mistress thereof, and under that in a smaller hand, a line she took from her father's first book and had known by heart since she was 9 years old. Nothing is entered here that is not proved. She blew on it. She shut the book. She went out through the covering yard in the dark with the candle in her hand, and she was not crying, and she did not sleep that night either, but for a completely different reason from the night before. He accepted the office on the Thursday. He did it in the dining room in front of Mr. Prendergast and 2 witnesses, and he signed his name to a memorandum of acceptance in a hand like a slash, and when it was done he looked up at Honora and said, Miss Slaney, I will give you an honest season, and you will find I am not idle. And she said, Thank you, Your Grace, and neither of them said anything else. He rode away and came back at 6 the next morning with his coat off and worked until dark, and that, she learned, was the whole of him. Whatever else the Duke of Kilcarrig was, He was not a man who could stand in a yard doing nothing. The covering season was on them. The stallion Cold Harbor was rising 24 years of age, a big plain dark bay with a white snip and hind legs like the props of a bridge, and he had been the best sire in Leinster in the year 10, and was now unfashionable in the way that a coat is unfashionable, which is to say that nothing whatever had happened to the coat. His book that spring had 11 outside mares in it. 11. Honora found the number in the fee book and sat looking at it for some time, and then went and found the covering book, which was kept by a man named Peter Fahey in a hand like a hedge, and counted 39 coverings for the previous season. 11 paid. 39 done. She began to make a list, and the list was the beginning of everything that came afterwards. On the 11th of April there was what the yard called the walking, which was the morning on which the mares were brought up from the paddocks in strings to be looked over, and the ones thought to be in foal from the previous year drawn off, and the ones to be covered set aside, and it was a public morning, because 4 or 5 neighboring men always came to see. That year there were more than 4 or 5. There were 19. They came because word had gone round Kildare in 8 days flat that Barnaby Vesey had left his stud to a Dublin clerk, and his Grace of Kilcarrig to the Dublin clerk along with it, and 19 gentlemen rode over that morning to look at a woman. Sir Hesketh Nangle came, on a hunter worth 300 guineas, with 2 of his own men behind him. Mr. Thrale came with a notebook. They stood along the rail of the covering yard, and the sun came out, which it had not done in a fortnight, and the whole flat green country steamed. The Duke had his coat off and his sleeves turned back to the elbow. He was working the gate with Fergus Dolan, and he did not once look at the rail. Honora came down the steps of the office with the ledger under her arm and her father's pencil case in her pocket, in her grey wool riding habit buttoned to the throat, because she owned nothing else that would do. With her hair pinned low and her hands in worn brown gloves, and she took her stand at the head of the yard where the mistress of a stud stands, and there was a small sound along the rail which she chose to interpret as coughing. Sir Hesketh Nangle said, loudly and cheerfully, "Well now, and are we to have the pleasure of watching the young lady draw the mares?" The Duke said, without looking up, "We are, Sir Hesketh, and if you have a wager to make, I will take the other end of it." That was not what Honora had expected. She turned her head very slightly, and he was not looking at her. Nangle said, "Oh, I would not take a lady's money," and one of his men laughed. They brought the first string up. There were 12 mares in it, all brown and bay and roan, wet to the hocks, and old Fergus Dolan said the names as they came, and Honora wrote each one down and looked. She was aware of 19 men leaning on a rail. She was aware that her ears had gone hot. And then, in the way that had happened to her all her life, at exactly the moment she needed it, the men went away, and the rail went away, and there was nothing in the world but 12 mares walking across wet cobbles and the light on their sides. Because here is the thing about being in foal. In April, at that stage, it does not show. A mare 5 months gone looks like a mare that has been eating well. But there are other things. There is the way she stands with her weight back off her forehand. There is the deep, flat, quiet look. The way the flank drops in front of the stifle. The very slight dullness that comes into a mare's coat at that stage and goes again in May. And there is the way she carries her tail, and there is the thing her father had told her, which no book contains, which is that a mare in foal will let another mare come nearer to her hindquarters than she will at any other time in her life, because she has stopped competing. Honora said, that gray with the 2 white hind, and the small brown with the mealy nose, and the one with the crooked blaze in the middle there. Those 3 are in foal. The bay at the back with the good shoulder, the one they have written as in foal in the book, is not, and she has been mated to a stallion twice, and I will want to know when and to what. Because if the book says she is in foal and she is not, then somebody has been paid for a covering that has not held, and nobody has been told. There was a silence along the rail of a specific quality. Fergus Dolan looked at Peter Fahey. Peter Fahey looked at the cobbles. The Duke straightened up from the gate very slowly. Sir Hesketh Nangle said, "That is a bold hand for a first morning." Honora said, "It is not bold, Sir Hesketh. It is written down." And she opened the ledger and read out, in the flat voice of a person reading a column of figures, the entry of the bay mare's covering in the previous May, and the fee charged, and the receipt not entered. And then she read the veterinary bill of the following November, for a mare that had slipped her foal and had not been named in the bill, and she said, "There is only one mare on this farm who was under the vet that week, and she is standing in front of you, and you have been carrying her as in foal for 5 months." They brought up the second string and the third. She did them all. She was wrong twice out of 61, which she knew that night when she checked her own list against Fergus Dolan's memory, and which nobody on the rail ever found out, because the 2 she was wrong about were both wrong in the safe direction. And then, at the end of it, when the last string had gone back down to the paddocks, and the men were pushing off the rail and reaching for their reins, a young gentleman from Athey called out, half in fun, "And can you tell blood as well as bellies, ma'am?" And there was a laugh, and Honora Slaney looked up. She said, "Whose is the chestnut 4-year-old your groom is holding?" He said, "Mine, bought at Ballsbridge in the autumn, and God knows what he is," the card said, by Waterloo out of a mare of Mr. Cronin's, and there is no more to it than that. She walked down the yard. She was aware, again distantly, that 19 men had stopped moving. She went up to the chestnut and put her hand on his neck and turned his head towards the light and looked at the white on his off hind, which came up in a ragged point above the fetlock and had one dark spot in it the size of a shilling, and at the double whorl low on his crest, and she stood back. She said, "He is not by Waterloo. He is by a horse called Ardnacrusha, who stood 4 seasons at Portarlington and died in the year 16, and his dam is a chestnut mare with the same mark on the same leg, who was sold out of Mr. Cronin's yard in the year 14 to a man in Queen's County, and if you write to Portarlington they will have the covering in the book, because it was my father who wrote that book, and I copied it out fair when I was 19. The young gentleman said, "Well, I am damned." Nobody laughed. Sir Hesketh Nangle sat on his 300 guinea hunter and looked at her, and there was nothing at all in the small flint-colored eyes, and after a moment he touched his hat to her, which frightened her much more than anything he had said in the hall. And when she turned back up the yard, the Duke of Kilcarrig was standing in the gateway with his sleeves rolled and a lead rein over his shoulder, watching her come, and his face had an expression on it that she had not seen there before and could not read, and he stood aside to let her pass and said, quietly, so that no one else heard it, Miss Slaney, "That was well done." She said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and went past him and up the steps and into the office and shut the door, and stood with her back against it and her heart going like a bird in a bag. She is not anything. She got out the register and wrote for 2 hours. What followed was the strangest summer of her life, and she was happy in it in a way she did not admit to herself until it was nearly over. She rose at 4:30. She was in the yard by 5 with the ledger and a lantern in the first weeks and no lantern by the middle of May. She learned 61 mares by name and by face, and then by voice, because horses have voices. And by August she could stand in the middle of the middle paddock in the dark and say who had just called from the far end of it. She learned the ground, which of the 1,100 acres held water in a wet March, which 2 fields grew bone, and which 3 grew nothing but fat, where the limestone came near the surface and threw up grass that put substance into a foal's front legs. She learned the men. There were 14 of them, and they had spent 9 years being paid late by a dying man, and they were watching her the way men watch weather. She paid them on the Saturday. She paid them on the Saturday if she had to sell her father's silver-mounted whip to do it, which in the 2nd week of June she did, for £4.15 in Nos, and told nobody, and she wrote. Every night, from 9 until 1 or 2 in the morning, at the standing desk in the office with the shutterless hatch, with the ledgers and the covering books and the fee books and the veterinary bills of 19 years piled around her, Honora Slaney built the Rathmoyne Register. It was not one book. That was the thing nobody understood until the end, and it was the thing her father had tried to make the stewards understand in the year 11 and failed. A pedigree is not a claim. It is a knot of independent facts, and if it is true, then every strand of the knot will agree with every other strand, even though the strands were made by strangers who never met. The covering book says a mare was served on a date. The fee book says money passed. The Farrier's Day book says the same mare was shot at the same place in the same week. The Ferry book says she crossed the water on the Tuesday and was charged 2pence. The veterinary surgeon's book says he saw her about a strained back sinew on the Friday. 6 men, 6 books, 6 hands, none of them in collusion, all of them agreeing. That is proof, and nothing else is. Her father had had 2 strands of that knot in the year 11, and Sir Hesketh Nangle had had a baronetcy, and 2 strands had not been enough. She was going to bring 6. But first, she found the 11 mares. It took her from the 2nd week of April to the last week of May, and she found them in the most ordinary way imaginable, which was by reading the whole of the estate correspondence file in date order, all 406 letters of it, which no one had ever done because no one ever does. In the November of the year 17, with Barnaby Vesey ill in bed and unable to come down, Mr. Gideon Thrale had written to Mr. Prendergast offering, out of pure neighborly feeling, to relieve the old gentleman of the burden of managing his sales, since his Grace's agent was in the district in any case, and it would be no trouble at all. And in the 18 months that followed, 11 mares had left Rathmoyne. Every one of them had gone by private treaty. Not one had been to a public sale. And all 11 had gone to the same buyer, and the buyer was Sir Hesketh Nangle of Ballycrana, and the prices were £40, £35, £42, and so downward, for mares that Honora, who had spent 4 years copying what mares like that made at Ballsbridge, valued between £150 and £300 apiece. And in the same file, in the January of the year 18, there was a short and perfectly innocent note from Mr. Thrale to the same Mr. Prendergast enclosing his account for services in the matter of the Rathmoyne sales, being commissioned at 5 per centum upon the gross, together with disbursements, and asking that it be paid out of the estate. He had taken a commission from the seller. Honora sat back on the high stool with that letter in her hand and thought, very clearly, you did not steal it. You did it in writing, in a file, with a receipt, because you have never in your life met anybody who reads. 4 of the 11 mares were of Moon Waters blood. She copied every one of those letters twice, once for the register and once for a second copy which she wrapped in oilcloth and gave to Mrs. Bracken to put at the bottom of the linen press, and Mrs. Bracken took it without a single question, and said only, "Is it the sort of thing a house might burn for?" And Honora said, "It might." And Mrs. Bracken said, "Then I shall put the other one in the church." Mr. Thrale came in the last week of May with 9 mares. He came himself, which he need not have done, riding beside the string with his hands washing each other in the air. And he was very pleasant. His Grace's own mares, he said, from Kilcarrig, 9 of the best. And would Miss Slaney be so good as to have them covered by the old horse? Honora said that she would, and that the fee was 15 guineas a mare, and that she would have the money at the time of service and enter the receipt. Mr. Thrale laughed. He said, "My dear Miss Slaney, His Grace is master of this stud." She said, "His Grace is master of this stud, and he takes £100 a year for it, and these are his private mares from his own place, and they are outside mares like any others, and the fee is 15 guineas each, £135 for the 9, and I shall give you a receipt in the register." He said, "Put it against the account." She said, "There is no account." He said, "Then open one. We are all one family here." And he said it in a voice of such enormous and comfortable patience that she understood he had said this exact sentence to 100 people in his life, and that it had worked on 99 of them. And Honora Slaney, who had heard a clause read aloud in a dining room 7 weeks earlier, and had written it out afterwards from memory, and had read it every night since the way other women read a psalm, said, "Very well, Mr. Thrale, nothing is entered on credit at Rathmoyne. If you will not pay in money, then the coverings will be entered upon the account of Rathmoyne, and I shall give you no receipt." And Mr. Thrale, who had been a land agent for 29 years and had never once been beaten by anybody, said, "Entered how you please, ma'am. Entered how you please," and rode away. And Honora walked back up the yard with her heart going hard, and wrote 9 lines in the register in her beautiful hand, each one ending in the same 6 words, "No fee paid, no receipt given." On the 4th of June, at 11 at night, Silver Ash began to foal, and it went wrong. Fergus Dolan came to the house for her. The mare was down in the straw of the big box at the end with her sides heaving and one small white foot showing and nothing else, and old Dolan said, "It is a leg back, ma'am, and I have not the hand for it any more, and my arm is too short by half." And Honora said, "Then it will have to be me," and she was already unbuttoning her cuffs when the Duke of Kilcarrig came through the door of the box in his shirt sleeves with the rain coming off him. He said, "How long has she been down?" Dolan said, 40 minutes. He said, "Right, he got down in the straw at the mare's back end, and Honora got down at her head, and for the next 6 hours those 2 people worked together in a box 12 feet square by the light of 2 lanterns hung on nails. He had the arm for it, and she had the head for it." She held the gray mare's head in her lap on the straw and talked to her, steadily without stopping, about nothing at all, about the weather and the state of the middle paddock and the price of oats, and every time the mare tried to heave up out of it, Honora leaned her whole weight on the great bony jaw and said, "No, my darling, lie still now, lie still." And the Duke worked, with his shirt soaked through and his face gray with effort, and twice he said, "I cannot find it," and twice she said, "Then rest a minute and find it after," and he rested and found it after. At 5:10 in the morning, with the light coming gray and pink in the doorway, and a blackbird going mad in the beech trees, a gray filly foal came out into the straw in a rush, and lay there steaming, and lifted her head. Nobody said anything for a while. The Duke sat back on his heels in the straw, filthy to the shoulder, with his arms hanging, and looked at the foal. And then he looked across at Honora Slaney, who was sitting on the floor of a loose box with a mare's head in her lap and straw in her hair and her sleeves rolled to the elbow and tears running straight down her face without any expression at all. And he said, "Miss Slaney." She said, "I am quite well. She is the full sister of a horse that was sold out of here for 40 guineas. He said, "Which horse?" And she said, "I do not know yet, but I am going to find him." They named the gray filly Bright Ash, and after the 4th of June something between Honora Slaney and the Duke of Kilcarrig was different, and both of them handled it in exactly the same way, which was by working. He came at 6 and stayed till dark, and they talked about horses. She discovered that he knew a very great deal, and that almost all of it had been learned by hand and none of it written down, and that he had a countryman's eye for a bad foreleg that no book could have given him. He discovered that she could hold 19 years of a stud's produce in her head and turn it over like a man turning a coin, and that when she said a thing was so she had first made certain, and that she never once in 5 months guessed at anything in his hearing. She began to catch him watching her. He began to catch her catching him, and to look away first, which she found she thought about at night more than she wished to. In the 2nd week of July there came to Rathmoyne a stiff card in silver grey requesting the honour of Miss Slaney's company at Kilcarrig Court on the 29th, dinner at 7, and a country ball to follow, and it was written in a lady's hand. Mrs. Bracken looked at it for a long time. She said, "You must go." Honora said, "I have a grey riding habit and a black stuff gown that I buried a man in." "Mrs." Bracken said, "Then we will do what women have done since Eve." And they cut up a white muslin of Barnaby Vesey's late sister's, 40 years out of date, and yellowed at the folds, and Mrs. Bracken washed it in rainwater and pressed it damp, and they took the sleeves out and made them plain long ones, and put a single narrow band of grey ribbon under the bosom, and Honora Slaney went to Kilcarrig Court in a gown that had cost, all told, 9 pence for thread. Kilcarrig Court was enormous and cold, and half shut up. She saw at once, coming up the avenue in the gig, what he had meant about the roof. The long gallery had buckets in it, arranged with a sort of grim tidiness at intervals, 11 of them, and the great house had 31 rooms, of which she was later told 9 were in use. But it was lit that night, every window of the south front, and there were carriages on the sweep, and a fiddler and a piper on the terrace, and 130 people of the county of Kildare came to look at the girl from Rathmoyne. She had expected that. What she had not expected was to be seated at dinner between an elderly deaf clergyman and an empty chair, at the very far end of a table of 40, below the 2 Miss Corcorans and below the agent's wife, in the place that is given to a governess who has been asked out of charity, and to have to sit there for 2 hours with her back very straight, while the whole length of the table talked past her. The Honourable Vivienne Estridge sat at the Duke's right hand. She looked, that night, magnificent, in cherry-coloured silk with a great deal of gold about the sleeves and a diamond at her throat that would have re-roofed the gallery, and she was, Honora had to allow, genuinely amusing, with a light, quick way of talking that made men laugh. And she laughed herself, often, and put her hand on his sleeve when she did it. Twice during dinner, the Duke of Kilcarrig looked down the length of that table, and Honora looked at her plate. It was afterwards, in the interval before the dancing, in the small yellow drawing room where the ladies had gone, and where there was a screen of japanned wood across the corner by the fire and a bad draught, that Honora found herself standing behind that screen with a glass of negus she did not want, doing what she had done at Dunes for 4 years, which was to make herself invisible until it was safe. And Lady Vivienne came in with 2 of the Miss Corcorans and a Mrs. French, and they stood on the other side of the screen. "It is really rather touching," said Lady Vivienne. "She has washed her hands." One of the Miss Corcorans laughed. Mrs. French said, "But is it true, though, about the will?" "Perfectly true," said Lady Vivienne. "He is bound to her for 7 years, poor darling, and he does it very well, and Papa says that if he had not accepted, the whole of Kilcarrig would have gone under the hammer within a 12-month, and there would have been no marriage at all. So one must be grateful to the horse girl, in a way. But it will not last." "Why will it not last?" said Mrs. French. "Because," said Lady Vivienne, patiently, as one explains something to a child, a stud farm is not a shop. It cannot be kept by writing in a book. It wants capital, and blood, and a name, and she has none of the 3. And her father was a person who was put out of the turf club for lying about a horse. And when it fails, and it will fail by the spring, Sir Hesketh Nangle will buy it, and Adair will be free. And we shall be married at St. George's in October, and I shall never set foot in this dreadful, wet country again." "Poor little thing," she said, and one heard the shrug in her voice. "She looks at him, you know. It is the saddest thing I ever saw in my life." They went out. Honora stood behind the Japan screen with the negus in her hand for a count of 50, because she had learned in a tack room in April exactly how long it takes for a group of people to get out of earshot, and then she came out from behind the screen and set the glass down on a table, and walked out of the yellow drawing room and along the passage and out through a side door into the July night. There was a moon. The gardens at Kilcarrig had been beautiful once and were now grass, and she walked down the length of what had been a yew walk, with the fiddle music coming out of the house behind her getting thinner and thinner, and she stopped at the end of it by a broken stone bench and stood in the dark with her arms folded across herself very hard. She looks at him. That was the sentence. Not the father, not the lying, not the horse girl, none of it. The only one that went in was that a stranger had been able to see it across a dinner table, and she had not known that it was on her face. She heard him coming a long way off because he came fast on the grass. He said, "Miss Slaney." She said, "I am admiring your yew walk, your grace. There is a very great deal of it." He stopped a few feet away. He said, "They have put you at the bottom of the table." She said, "They have." He said, "I did not do the placing. My aunt did the placing." She said, "Your aunt is quite correct. I am a stud farmer of no family, and I am 28 places from the salt, and if she had put me higher there, would have been a paragraph about it in the Dublin papers on Thursday." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is not an answer, that is a defense." She said, "It is what I have." He said, "Miss Slaney," and stopped, and started again, and said, "In April, in the tack room." She stood absolutely still. He said, "The hatch." I did not know about the hatch until Fergus Dolan told me last week, and he told me because he has been at Rathmoyne for 41 years and he thinks I am a fool. And I have been trying since Tuesday to find a way to say this that is not worse than saying nothing, and there is not one. So I shall simply say it. I said that you were not anything. And she said, "Yes, you did." And he said, "It was a filthy thing to say, and it was said out of vanity, because I had been made ridiculous in front of my whole county, and I wanted to hand it on to somebody smaller, which is the oldest and cheapest trade there is. And what I said about your father, I said, knowing nothing about it whatsoever. On the strength of a story I had off a man at a dinner in the year 14, I have no defense, and I do not ask for one. But I would rather you heard me say it than go on thinking that I did not know I had said it. Honora Slaney looked at the ruined yew walk in the moonlight for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was not quite hers. She said, "Do you know what the worst of it was?" He said, "No." She said, "It was not what you said. It was that I had spent 4 days before it thinking that something good had happened to me." And then he said, and the way he said it was worse than anything, Miss Slaney, "Something good has happened to you." And she said, "No, Your Grace. Something good has happened to Rathmoyne." And she picked up her 9-penny skirt and walked back up the yew walk to the house, and danced twice. Once with the deaf clergyman, and once with a farmer from Ballymore Eustace, and went home at midnight in the gig with Fergus Dolan driving, and at 1:30 in the morning she was at the standing desk in the office in her nightgown with a shawl over it, writing "The thing arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of September," in a bundle of English sporting papers that came to Rathmoyne every fortnight because Barnaby Vesey had taken them for 30 years, and nobody had thought to stop the order. Honora read them at the kitchen table after the yard was quiet, with a cup of tea going cold the way she read everything, from the top left corner to the bottom right. And on the 4th page of the second paper there was an account of the great race at Doncaster in the north of England, and it said that the race had been won for the 2nd year in a canter, by 5 lengths, by the chestnut horse Ashen King, the property of Mr. Everard Buick of Malton, and that there was now no horse in England who would stand in front of him. And it said, in the way those papers do, that the animal was of unknown or at least unauthenticated Irish extraction, having been purchased as a yearling out of a lot at Liverpool, and that it was a great pity, and that Mr. Buick's misfortune in the matter of the pedigree was well known. Honora sat quite still. Then she got up and went out through the dark to the office and got the covering book of the year 13 and brought it back and put it on the kitchen table under the lamp and turned the pages until she came to the entry, "In Peter Fahey's hedge of a hand for the grey mare Silver Ash, covered by Cold Harbour on the 2nd and 5th of May." And then she got the foaling book of the year 14 and found on the 22nd of April, "Chestnut Colt out of Silver Ash by Cold Harbour, star, off hind white to fetlock, nigh 4 cornet white, large head." And then she got the sale book of the year 15 and found in Barnaby Vesey's own writing, "Gone to a jobber at Liverpool, 40 guineas, and beside it, in the same hand, and in ink that had been pressed so hard the nib had spread, the words, "God forgive me." She put her hands flat on the kitchen table. Mrs. Bracken, who was banking the fire, looked round and said, "What is it?" And Honora said, in a voice that did not sound like her own, "Mrs. Bracken, the best horse in England was foaled in the middle box at the end of this yard, and Mr. Vesey sold him for 40 guineas because he could not write his mother's name." The next paper, 3 pages further on, carried an advertisement. It was set in a black box, and it had evidently been running for some time, and it said that Mr. Everard Buick of Malton in the county of York would pay the sum of 200 guineas for evidence, such as should satisfy the stewards, of the descent of the chestnut horse Ashen King, foaled in Ireland in the spring of 1814, and that he desired it to be known that he had no wish to purchase an opinion, but only a proof, and that all communications would be answered. There was a further paragraph beneath it, in smaller type, which said that Mr. Buick had been obliged to withdraw his intention of standing the horse at Malton for the coming season at 50 guineas a mare, no subscriber being willing to breed to a horse who could not be entered. 50 guineas a mare. 40 mares in a season. Honora Slaney did the sum on the back of the paper with a pencil and looked at it for a while and then put her head in her hands and laughed. And Mrs. Bracken thought she was crying and came over and found that she was doing both. Because it was not 200 guineas. It was never 200 guineas. What was sitting in front of her, in a smudged black box in an English paper in a farm kitchen in the county of Kildare, was the whole of it, all at once, the entire shape of the thing her father had died inside of. And it went like this. If the gray mare Moonwater's pedigree was false, then her daughter Silver Ash was nothing, and Silver Ash's son Ashen King was nothing, and the best horse in England was a horse of no blood at all who could not stand at stud in his own country, and whose owner was advertising in the papers like a man who had lost a dog. And if the gray mare Moonwater's pedigree was true, then Denise Slaney had told the truth in the year 11, and Sir Hesketh Nangle had sworn a lie on his honor before the stewards of the Turf Club, and Ashen King was of the oldest and best mare line in Ireland, and every grey filly standing out in the wet paddocks of Rathmoyne that night, 11 of them, was worth not the £40 that Mr. Thrale had been selling them for, but something no one in Kildare had put a figure on since before she was born. They were the same fact. That was the beauty of it, and it took her until 3 o'clock in the morning to stop shaking about it. There was one truth, and it went in both directions at once, and it could not be argued with, because it was not an opinion or a family feeling or a daughter's loyalty. It was a knot of dates. Either the mare was at Rathmoyne on the 14th of April in the year 7, or she was not, and if she was, then a large number of other things about a large number of other people became true at the same instant, and no baronet in Ireland could talk it away. She wrote to Mr. Everard Buick that night. She was careful. She did not tell him what she had. She told him what she was looking for and how long it would take. And she asked him 3 questions. Whether he had the original bill of sale from the Liverpool lot, whether he had ever had the horse's markings taken down by a competent person, and whether he would object to those markings being compared before witnesses with an entry in a foaling book kept in Ireland in the year 14. She signed it H. Slaney and gave the address of Rathmoyne, and it went on the Wednesday mail, and it was 17 days before the answer came. In the meantime, she told the Duke of Kilcarrig. She had not intended to. She had gone 6 times in her head over whether to tell him at all, because he was bound to her by a covenant, and engaged to a woman who was waiting for her to fail, and because there was a part of Honora Slaney that had been trained by 4 years at Dunes to expect that anything she said aloud would be repeated by somebody at a rail. But on the Friday morning he came into the office to argue with her about wintering the 2-year-olds, and stopped and looked at the desk and said, "You have not been to bed," and she said no. And then she heard herself say, "Sit down, Your Grace. I am going to tell you something, and you are not going to like all of it." She told him for 1 hour and 10 minutes. She laid the books out on the desk in order, and took him through it the way her father had taught her, 1 strand at a time, and she did not say the word father once until the very end. When she came to the 11 mares and the private sales and Mr. Thrale's commission of 5 per centum, the Duke of Kilcarrig got up out of the chair and went and stood at the window with his back to her and did not speak for the best part of a minute. Then he said, without turning round, "Show me the letters." She gave them to him. He read all 4. Twice he put them down on the desk very carefully, squaring the edges, and she saw that his hands were not quite steady, and he said, That man has had the running of my property since I was 21 of age. She said, I know. He said, he stood at my father's funeral with his hat in his hands. She said, I know. He said, Miss Slaney, how much of my life is a lie? And she said that I cannot tell you, but I can tell you exactly how much of your book is, because I have counted it, and it is 11 mares, and 4 of them were gray. He turned round. He said, what do you need? She said, I need to go to Athy, and to Ballymore Eustace, and to Portarlington, and to the parish of Kilcullen, and I need a car, and a fortnight, and about £11. And I need you to say nothing whatever to Mr. Thrale, and to go on being exactly as pleasant to him as you have always been. And if you cannot do that, then tell me now, because if he hears one word of this before I am ready, the books at Ballycrana will be in the fire inside a day, and there will never be another chance in my lifetime. The Duke of Kilcarrig looked at her across a standing desk in a small cold office off a covering yard. He said, I can be pleasant to a man I intend to destroy, Miss Slaney. It is practically the only accomplishment my class has left. And then he said, you shall have the car, and the fortnight, and the £11, and I shall come with you. And Honora, who had been awake for 22 hours and had just been offered the first help of her adult life, said the only thing she was capable of saying, which was, thank you, and then had to turn away and pretend to look for something in a drawer. They went out on the 11th of October in a hired inside car with a hood, and they were 15 days on the road, and Honora Slaney afterwards thought of that fortnight as the happiest of her life, which was an absurd thing to think about, a fortnight of wet lanes and cold inn parlors and the smell of other people's bacon. The first place was Athy. Mr. Ambrose Keeley was 81 years old and had been a veterinary surgeon for 53 of them, and he lived in a narrow house on the Barrow with a daughter who apologized for him, and he had in a lean-to at the back, in 49 tied bundles on shelves his son-in-law had built for the purpose, every day book he had ever kept. He was deaf and delighted. When Honora said her father's name, he took hold of her hand in both of his and said, ah, ah, and the poor man, and would not let go of it for some minutes. Then he said, which year? And she said, the spring of the year 7, and he got up on a chair, at 81, and would not be helped, and took down a bundle. It took them 4 hours. The day books were written in pencil in a spider's hand, with the weather at the top of each day and the charges in the margin, and on the 17th of April, 1807, between a cow at Barrowford and a mastiff at Castledermot, Mr. Ambrose Keeley had written Rathmoyne. Sir H. Nangle's grey mare Moonwater, kick on the near hawk, got in the paddock, fomented, dressed, to be kept up 2 days. 2 shillings and 6pence. Charge Rathmoyne. Honora put her finger on the line and did not take it off for a long while. The Duke of Kilcarrig, standing behind her chair in a lean-to in Athy, said, very quietly, that is 1. Mr. Keeley gave them the book. He would not take money for it. He said, tell them at the Turf Club that Ambrose Keeley has been writing down every animal he ever touched since the year 66, and that he never in his life put a word in a book to please a gentleman. And if they want to see me, they may come to Athy, for I am not going to them. The second was the Turnpike. The Kilcullen and Naas Turnpike Trust had kept its gate books since 1791, because the trustees were obliged by Act of Parliament to keep them, and the trustees had never in 30 years thrown away a sheet of paper, and they were all in a loft over the trust's office in Naas under a great deal of pigeon dirt. The Duke of Kilcarrig was a trustee. He had never once attended a meeting. He attended one on the 14th of October, in a coat he had borrowed from his own butler because his was ruined, and asked in a bored voice whether he might look at some old books, and the clerk nearly fell over himself. And for 2 days a duke and a stud farmer sat on upturned crates in a pigeon loft in Nas going through toll receipts. They found it on the second afternoon, 12th April, 1807. One mare led, Ballycrana towards Rathmoyne, 1 penny halfpenny. Entered by Owen Cassidy, gatekeeper. And underneath, in the same hand, on the 18th 1 mare led, Rathmoyne towards Ballycrana, 1 penny halfpenny. She had gone out, and she had come back, and a man had written it down for 3 farthings, and forgotten it inside a week, and it had been sitting over a solicitor's office in Nas for 12 years, while Denise Slaney died of it. Honora went outside and stood in the yard behind the trust's office for a few minutes. The Duke did not follow her, which she was grateful for, and when she came back in her face was washed and quite composed, and she said, "That is 2 and 3, because there are 2 entries, and they are separate facts." And he said 4. "If you count the halfpenny, for a man does not invent a halfpenny." And she laughed, which surprised them both. The farrier was easy because Larry Meany was still alive and still shoeing at Clonamore, and his father's daybook was in the forge in a box under the bellows with the mice at it. And on the 15th of April, 1807, at Rathmoyne, 4 removes, Sir H. N.'s grey mare, 7pence. The parish register at Kilcullen gave them Owen Cassidy's burial in 1816, which mattered, because it meant the gatebook could not be got at. And the last one, the one that turned all the rest from a case into a weapon, they found on the 23rd of October at the 4th lock of the Grand Canal above Sallins, where a man of 63 named Martin Cuff kept the gates and lived in a whitewashed cottage with a cat and a bad chest. He had been Sir Hesketh Nangle's stud groom from 1798 to 1811. Honora had found his name in the Ballycrana wage list that was pasted into the back of the Rathmoyne fee book, because in those days neighboring studs shared their lists to check each other's men, and she had spent 9 days finding out where he had gone. He knew her at once. He said, "You are Denny Slaney's girl." And then he sat down on the wall of the lock and said, "I have been waiting 13 years for somebody to come up that towpath." He told them everything in about 40 minutes. He led the grey mare Moonwater from Ballycrana to Rathmoyne on the 12th of April in the year 7, and 2 others, a bay and a brown, on the 9th and the 24th of the same month, and he was told to go by the low road and not through the village. He led them because Sir Hesketh Nangle's own stallion, Ballycrana Chief, had covered 31 mares in the season of 1806 and got 4 foals, and had begun the season of 1807 in the same way, and Sir Hesketh had 11,000 pounds of stud reputation standing on that horse and 40 subscribers who had paid in advance. And so the best of the mares went quietly across the country to Rathmoyne in the night to be covered by Barnaby Vesey's horse Portreeve, and the foals were entered in the Ballycrana book as got by Ballycrana Chief. And 3 of those foals were the making of that stud, and one of them was the mare from whom every horse Sir Hesketh Nangle had sold in the last 8 years descended. He said, and your father had it all in his book, not to spite anybody. He had it because he wrote down what he saw, and he saw the mares come in, and he wrote the true sires in Mr. Vesey's covering book, because that is what a covering book is for. And when he came before the stewards in the year 11 with the grey mare's entry, it was not the grey mare he was going to be destroyed for. It was the other 2. Because if the grey mare was at Rathmoyne on the 14th of April, then so were they, and it is all in the one page, ma'am. The three of them are in the one page in his hand, and the minute they let that page stand, Sir Hesketh Nangle's whole book was a lie, and every horse he had sold for 4 years was got by another man's horse. He was quiet for a while. The canal went by. He said, he came to me the night before the hearing. He gave me 11 guineas and a character, and told me I was to go to my sister in Waterford until it was over, and I went. God forgive me. And I have been minding a lock ever since on 12 shillings a week, and I would do the 13 years again to be sitting here saying this. Will you swear it? Said the Duke of Kilcarrig. Martin Cuff looked up. He said, Who are you? And the Duke said, I am Kilcarrig. And the old man said, Then you will know what it costs a small man to swear against a big one, your grace. And the Duke said, I am beginning to. Cuffey said, I will swear it in front of the whole Turf Club and the Lord Lieutenant and the Bishop of Kildare, and I will say it slow so the reporters can write it down. And then he began to cough, and could not stop for a while, and Honora gave him her own handkerchief, and made him tea in his own cottage, and when they left she took his statement in writing in her own hand and read it back to him twice, and had it witnessed by the lock-keeper above, and the lock-keeper below, and by a boatman named Dowd, and put it in the oilcloth. They drove back to Rathmoyne on the 25th of October in the dark, with the hood up and the rain going across the lamps. Neither of them spoke for about 6 miles. Then the Duke of Kilcarrig said, Into the dark, Miss Slaney, when this is finished, and stopped. And Honora Slaney sat very still with her hands in her lap and every nerve in her body listening. And after a moment he said, When this is finished, you will have a stud that is worth 40,000 pounds, and there will not be a man in Ireland who will not want the running of it. She said, I have the running of it. He said yes, and then, after a while, that was not what I began to say. She said, I know. And that was all either of them said. And the car went on through the rain, and at Rathmoyne the lamp was burning behind the fanlight, and Mrs. Bracken was up, and there was a letter on the hall table from Malton in the county of York in a heavy commercial hand, and Honora opened it standing in the hall in her wet cloak, and read it, and then read it again, and then sat down on the stairs. Mr. Everard Buick wrote like a man who paid for his own paper. Madam, he said, I have your letter and I answer your 3 questions in order. 1. I have the bill of sale from the Liverpool lot of the 22nd of June, 1815, and the jobber's name upon it, which was Hollins, and Hollins is alive at Ormskirk and will speak. 2. I had the horse's markings taken down in the spring of 1816 by Mr. Soden, veterinary surgeon of Malton. Because I have been 30 years in the iron trade, and I do not buy anything I have not measured, and I have his certificate, which describes a star, a white off-hind to the fetlock with 1 dark spot in the white above the joint, and a white coronet on the nigh fore. 3. I should not object to the comparison. I should give a year of my life for it. Madam, he wrote, at the end, I am told by everybody that you are a young woman of no standing, and that I should be careful. I have been told all my life to be careful by men who were born to money, and I have observed that what they generally mean is that I should be careful not to succeed. If you have the books, bring them, and I will come to Ireland at whatever hour you name, and I will bring my own solicitor and Mr. Soden and the bill of sale, and I will pay every farthing of the cost of it, whatever the end may be. Yours, Everard Buick. Honora Slaney read that letter perhaps 40 times over the following winter. On the 9th of November, through Mr. Prendergast, She laid before the stewards of the Turf Club a written application for the reopening of the minute of the 14th of June, 1811, touching the Mare Moonwater, and she named the evidence she proposed to produce without producing it, and she asked for a hearing at which all parties might attend. Mr. Prendergast said, "You understand, Miss Slaney, that they will refuse." She said, "They may refuse 3 times. They cannot refuse the 4th time if Mr. Buick is standing behind me, because Mr. Buick's horse is the best horse in England, and the English will not let an Irish committee sit on a question about the best horse in England forever." Mr. Prendergast took off his spectacles and polished them and said, "Where did you learn to think like that?" And she said, "At a rostrum in Ship Street, watching men who had everything be frightened of men who had one thing." It took 4 days for Balacrana to hear of it. Sir Hesketh Nangle came to Rathmoyne on the 13th of November and was shown into the dining room where the will had been read, and he did not sit down. He said, "I hear you have been in Noss." She said, "I have been in a good many places." He said, "Miss Slaney, I am going to be plain with you, because you are a sensible young woman and there is no profit in fencing. I will give you £2,800 for this place as it stands. The land, the house, the stock, and the books." She said, "No." He said, 3,500, and I will take the stock at valuation on top of it. She said, "No." And there was a small pause, and then Sir Hesketh Nangle said, in a completely different voice, quite soft, "Do you know what happens to a girl of 24 who takes on the whole of a county?" She said, "Yes, I watched it happen to my father, who was a man of 41, and who was not taking on a county, but only trying to keep a book straight. The difference between us, Sir Hesketh, is that he had 2 facts. She held up her hand and counted on the fingers of it, slowly, without saying a single word, up to 6. And then she put her hand down. He went white about the mouth. He said, "You will regret this," and she said, "I have regretted nearly everything, Sir Hesketh. It is not a thing that stops me any more." And he took up his hat and went. The petition was filed on the 2nd of December. It was drawn by an eminent man in Dublin, and it was paid for by nobody anyone could name, and it asked the court to set aside the will of Barnaby Vesey on 3 grounds: that the testator at the date of execution was not of sound and disposing mind by reason of disease and the free use of laudanum; that the condition affecting his Grace the Duke of Kilcarrig was contrary to public policy and void, and that the whole instrument fell with it; and, in the 3rd paragraph, that the said Honora Slaney, a young unmarried woman previously unknown to the testator, had procured the said will by residing alone in the house of the deceased during the last days of his illness, and exercising an influence over him which the court would readily infer. She read the 3rd paragraph in the office with the door shut, and then went out into the yard and picked up a bucket and carried it 50 yards for no reason at all, and set it down, and stood there. The Duke of Kilcarrig came to Rathmoyne on the 6th of December, and he had a piece of paper folded in his breast pocket, and he did not show it to her. What she learned afterwards, and not from him, was that the Earl of Estridge had put a proposal to him in writing at the end of November, which ran as follows: that his lordship would discharge the whole £11,400 upon the marriage, that his daughter's portion would be 40,000, that he required only that his Grace should sign an affidavit in support of the petition, to the effect that Mr. Vesey had been wandering in his mind in the March of 1819, and that on the whole his lordship would prefer the wedding to be in England. He did not tell her about it. What he told her, on the 11th of January, standing in the office in his greatcoat, with his hat in his hand, was that he was obliged to go to Dublin on business of his own, and did not know when he would be back, and Honora Slaney, who had not slept properly since the 2nd of December, heard the sentence, looked at his face, and thought, "There it is." She said, "Of course, Your Grace." He said, "Miss Slaney." She said, "The 2-year-olds are to go on the far hill, and not the middle paddock, whoever gives the orders while you are away." He went. He was gone 11 days, and then he wrote from Dublin that it would be longer, and he was gone in all 31 days, and in those 31 days the following things happened at Rathmoyne. The Strangles came into the county. It came in at a fair at Kilcock in the last week of December, and by the middle of January it was in 4 yards, and Honora Slaney, who had read about it in her father's books and had never seen it, shut Rathmoyne. She shut it completely. Nothing came in and nothing went out for 6 weeks. No mare was taken in for wintering at any price. The 2 men who had been at the Kilcock Fair were paid full wages to stay in their own cottages for a fortnight and not come near the yard, and one of them was insulted about it, and she paid him anyway. Every bucket and every head collar was kept to its own box. She took the temperature of 61 horses every morning at 7 with a thermometer she paid 18 shillings for in Noss, and wrote every one of them down, and did it again at 4 in the afternoon, for 41 consecutive days. Ballycrana, which took in 11 wintering mares at 3 guineas a head in January because Sir Hesketh Nangle would not turn away money, lost 14 horses, of which 4 were mares in foal, and had the disease in the yard until April. Rathmoyne did not have one case. That fact went round the county of Kildare faster than the petition had, and it went round in a particular way, because it was the kind of fact that farmers repeat to each other over gates, and by the beginning of March there were men in that county who had laughed at the Dublin clerk in April, who were saying, in public houses, "Well, but she shut the place in January," which is more than Ballycrana did. And on the 14th of February, in the middle of all of it, Mr. Gideon Thrale wrote to Rathmoyne, and the letter was almost cheerful, because he had never in his life imagined that anything he wrote down could be used against him. He wished to inform Miss Slaney, for her book, that his Grace's 9 mares from Kilcarrig were all in foal to the old horse, and had wintered well, and that he trusted the arrangement had been satisfactory on both sides, and that he would be obliged if she would confirm that no fee stood outstanding upon them. Honora Slaney sat at the standing desk with that letter in her hand for a long, long time. Then she took out the register and opened it at the page she had written in May, with the 9 lines each ending in the same 6 words, and she copied Mr. Thrale's letter into the register underneath them, in full with the date, and pasted the original in beside it with flour paste, and wrote across the foot of the page, confirmed by the agent in writing, "No fee paid. No receipt given." And then she wrote to Mr. Prendergast at Noss, and asked him one short question about the construction of a clause, and Mr. Prendergast wrote back by return, and his letter was 4 lines long. And when she read it, she put both hands over her mouth and sat down on the floor of the office, and Mrs. Bracken, coming in with the lamp, found her sitting there with her back against the desk, laughing without making any noise at all. He came back on the 11th of February at 9 in the morning on a hired hack, because he no longer had a horse of his own. Honora saw that before she saw anything else, and she was standing in the covering yard with the thermometer book in her hand, and she said, without meaning to say it, "Where is the black horse?" The Duke of Kilcarrig got down off the hack and said, "Sold," she said. "Sold," he said, "and the 4 hunters, and the carriage horses, and the plate, and my father's library, which went to a bookseller in Dame Street for £640, and the pictures in the long gallery except 2 that nobody would take, and the silver. and my mother's diamonds, which I am told is a thing a gentleman does not mention, and which fetched 2,100. He put his hand in his breast pocket and took out a folded paper and gave it to her, and it was a banker's receipt in the name of Eustace Prendergast, attorney, of Nas, in trust, for £4,380, marked for the defense of the will of Barnaby Vesey, deceased. She could not speak. He said, "You had nothing. You had 1,100 acres you cannot sell, and 61 horses you will not sell, and about 90 pounds in a tin box, and they have retained the best man at the Irish bar to break that will, and it does not matter in the smallest degree how right you are if you cannot pay a man to stand up and say it for 11 days. So I sold the house's furniture. It has been standing under sheets for 19 years, and it was doing nobody any good, and I would like it very much if you did not look at me like that." Honora Slaney said, "Your Grace, I thought you had gone over to them." He said, "I know you did, and I let you think it," which was cowardly, because if it had got out in January what I was doing, they would have moved the petition on in Hillary term before the money was raised. "I am sorry," she said, "and the Earl of Estridge." He said, "Ah," and he looked out over the paddocks for a moment and said, "Lord Estridge made me an offer in November which would have paid everything and left me £40,000. All I was required to do was swear that Barnaby Vesey was out of his mind in March. I wrote to him on the 29th of January that I had considered it, and that I would not swear to it, because it was not true, the man being at that time so far in possession of his faculties that he gave me the covering dates of 6 seasons out of his head with the weather, and his lordship wrote back that in that case he must reconsider the whole connection, and I wrote that I thought he must. She said, and Lady Vivienne. He said, Lady Vivienne wrote me a very civil letter in which she released me, and I have no complaint of her whatsoever, and I will say for her that she was perfectly honest from the beginning about what she was buying and what she was not. It was I who was dishonest. Because I knew in July, Miss Slaney, I knew standing in a yew-walk in the moonlight in July. And there was a silence in the covering yard of Rathmoyne on the 11th of February, 1820, and a horse kicked a wall somewhere, and a jackdaw came down off the clock arch, and Honora Slaney, who had rehearsed every conversation of her adult life in advance, and had not rehearsed this one, heard herself say, "We have 41 mares to foal between the 8th of March and the 2nd of May, and I have not got the night rota done." And the Duke of Kilcarrig, after a moment, began to laugh, and said, "Then let us do the night rota, Miss Slaney." And they went into the office and did the night rota, and neither of them said one other word about it for 7 months, and both of them knew, and every single person on that farm knew, including the men, who had a book on it by the middle of March, which Fergus Dolan won in September at odds of 5-2. He had also brought back a bundle. It was tied in string, and it had come out of the papers of a Mr. Ferdinand Cope of Rathangan, deceased, whose executors had been selling up his effects at an auction in Kildare Street, which the Duke had attended for 4 days running, looking for something else entirely, and it was the printed subscription list and receipt book of the horse Ballycrana Chief for the season of 1807. 40 subscribers, 10 guineas each, payable in advance, and across the head of the printed bill, in capitals, the guarantee. In the words the trade used then, a full or no fee, subscriptions not returnable, 420 guineas taken in a single spring by a man whose horse in the season before had covered 31 mares and got 4 foals. Honora put it in the oilcloth with the rest. That spring was the best foaling season Rathmoyne had had in 15 years. 41 mares foaled and 39 foals lived, and 8 of them were gray. She had 2 hours sleep a night for 6 weeks, and Mrs. Bracken fed her standing up. And the Duke slept in the loft over the foaling boxes on a straw mattress with his boots on, and came down 4 and 5 times a night. And Fergus Dolan, who was 73, walked the paddocks at 2 in the morning, because he could not help it. Bright Ash, who was a yearling that spring, grew like a weed on the limestone grass, and had a way of standing with her head up looking at the far hill that made men lean on the rail. And at Kilcarrig, 21 miles away, between the 2nd of March and the 11th of April, 9 mares that had walked to Rathmoyne in the last week of May in the year 19 dropped 9 foals. And they were, as Mr. Thrale wrote with great satisfaction on the 14th of April, an uncommonly fine lot, 6 colts and 3 fillies, and 2 of them so promising that inquiries had already been received from England. Honora entered all 9 in the register, with their dates, their colors, and every white marking on every leg, because 2 of the mares had gone home in foal, and she had never seen the foals. And so she wrote to Mr. Thrale and asked, in a plain business hand, for the markings of each of the 9 for the Rathmoyne book. And Mr. Gideon Thrale, being a tidy man who liked to be asked for things he could supply, sent them by return, all 9, in his own hand, signed and dated. On the 2nd of June, the stewards of the Turf Club refused her application for the 2nd time. On the 19th of June, Mr. Everard Buick landed at Kingstown with his solicitor, his veterinary surgeon, the bill of sale of the 22nd of June, 1815, and a letter from 11 English breeders, and came to Rathmoyne. He turned out to be a short, broad, red-faced man of 55 in a plain brown coat, who said almost nothing for the first hour, and then asked 90 questions in a row. And he went through the Rathmoyne register at the long deal table, in the kitchen for 11 hours with a candle at his elbow, and at the end of it he shut it and put both hands flat on the cover, and said, "Miss Slaney, in 30 years in the iron trade I have never seen a set of books like that in my life, and I have bought 2 furnace companies. Who taught you?" And she said, "My father." And Mr. Buick said, "Then we shall put your father's name back in their book if I have to buy the building." On the 4th of July, the stewards granted the hearing. They granted it because Mr. Buick had written to the Jockey Club at Newmarket, and to 11 English breeders and to 2 newspapers, and because a question had been asked, very politely, in a paragraph in an English paper, as to whether the Irish Turf Club intended to sit forever upon the pedigree of the best horse in England. The hearing was fixed for the 14th of September, 1820, at the Town Hall in Naas, before 3 stewards and an assessor, all parties to attend, and it was to be public. And by the first week of September, there was not a bed to be had within 11 miles of the town. The town hall at Naas held about 200 people, and there were 310 in it on the morning of the 14th of September, and another 150 in the street outside, and 2 men from Dublin newspapers and 1 from an English one at a table by the window. 3 stewards sat at the top on a dais. Lord Dunavane, who was 70, and had been a steward for 31 years, and had sat on the original inquiry in the year 11, Colonel Aylmer Rusk of Moy Valley, and Mr. Roland Pye, who bred at Tullamore. Beside them sat an assessor to advise them on evidence, Mr. Sergeant Curtain, a small bald man with a face like a closed door. Sir Hesketh Nangle sat at the front on the right with 2 counsel and Mr. Gideon Thrale behind him. Honora Slaney sat at the front on the left with Mr. Prendergast, and behind her sat the Duke of Kilcarrig and Mr. Everard Buick, and Mr. Soden of Malton, and Mrs. Una Bracken in her good black, and Fergus Dolan in a collar that was strangling him, and, at the end of the row, with his hat on his knees and his bad chest, Mr. Martin Cuff, lock-keeper. She wore the grey wool riding habit, because it was what she had. She had a leather deal box on the floor at her feet with a brass lock, and in her hand a small notebook with a strap around it. 1 of 11. Nangle's leading counsel opened for 2 hours and 11 minutes. He was very good. He said that the Turf Club was not a court, and ought not to be turned into one at the instance of persons with a private grievance. That the minute of 1811 had been made after a full inquiry, at which the late Mr. Slaney had been heard, that it was a heavy thing to ask 3 gentlemen to say that a baronet of the county had sworn falsely upon a matter of 13 years' standing, and that the applicant was a young woman of no experience, unknown to the trade until 18 months ago, who had come into a valuable property in circumstances which were themselves the subject of proceedings, and whose interest in the matter was, he would say frankly, an interest of about £40,000. He said the word father 11 times, always kindly. He sat down. Lord Dunavain said, Miss Slaney, have you anybody to speak for you? Honora stood up. She said, my lord, I have Mr. Prendergast, who will address you upon the law if you require it. Upon the facts I shall speak myself, because there are 9 documents and I am the only person in this room who has read all of them. There was a certain amount of noise. She waited for it to finish. She said, my lord, I do not ask you to believe me. I ask you to believe 6 men who never met each other, none of whom was thinking about this question when he wrote, and 3 of whom are dead. And then, for 1 hour and 40 minutes, in the flat, unhurried voice of a person reading out a column of figures, Honora Slaney took the Rathmoyne Register apart in front of 310 people. She began with the thing they thought they knew. The minute of the 14th of June, 1811, which she read aloud in full, and which found that the entry of the mare Moonwater as covered at Rathmoyne on the 14th of April in the year 7 had been made without sufficient authority, and the sworn statement of Sir Hesketh Nangle upon which that finding rested, which was that the said mare had at no time in that spring left the lands of Ballycrana. She said, that is the whole of the case against my father. 1 sentence sworn by 1 man. I shall now take it away. The Rathmoyne covering book, the year 1807, produced, in the hand of Denise Slaney, at the table of Barnaby Vesey, 3 entries on 1 page. She held the page up and turned with it so that the room could see it, and she said, my lord, you will observe that there are 3 mares on this page and not 1, and I ask you to remember that, because it is the whole reason we are here. Second, the day book of Mr. Ambrose Keeley, veterinary surgeon, of Athy, 17th of April, 1807, produced together with the 49 bundles from which it came, and Mr. Keeley present in this room aged 82, having traveled 11 miles this morning in a covered car. A grey mare of Sir Hesketh Nangle's, kicked on the near hock, treated at Rathmoyne, 2 shillings and 6pence, charge Rathmoyne. Third, the day book of Meany, farrier, of Clonamore, 15th of April, 4 removes. Sir H.N., grey mare, at Rathmoyne, 7pence, 4th and 5th. The gate books of the Kilcullen and Naas Turnpike Trust, kept under the Act, produced from the Trust's own loft, by the Trust's own clerk, who is in this room, 12th of April, 1 mare led, Ballycrana towards Rathmoyne, 1 penny halfpenny, entered by Owen Cassidy, gatekeeper, buried at Kilcullen in the year 16, and 18th of April, 1 mare led, Rathmoyne towards Ballycrana, 1 penny halfpenny, same hand. My lord, she said, a mayor cannot be in 2 places, and a gatekeeper does not invent 3 farthings. Colonel Rusk said, from the dice, and who led her, ma'am? Honora Slaney said, I am obliged to you, Colonel. She turned round. She said, Mr. Cuff. Martin Cuff got up in his good coat and went to the table and was sworn, and stood with his hands on the back of a chair and told 310 people, slowly, so that the reporters could write it down, that he had led the grey mare Moonwater from Ballycrana to Rathmoyne on the 12th of April in the year 7 by the low road, being ordered not to go through the village, and a bay mare on the 9th, and a brown mare on the 24th of the same month, that the horse Ballycrana Chief had covered 31 mares in the season before, and got 4 foals, that 40 subscriptions at 10 guineas had been taken in advance for that horse in the season of 1807, that the foals of the 3 mares so led had been entered in the Ballycrana book as got by Ballycrana Chief, and that on the night of the 13th of June, 1811, Sir Hesketh Nangle had given him 11 guineas and a character and sent him to his sister in Waterford, and he had gone. The room did not make any noise at all. It was the loudest silence Honora had ever stood in. She said, 6th, the printed subscription list and receipt book of the horse Ballycrana Chief for the season of 1807. 40 subscribers, 10 guineas each, payable in advance, subscriptions not returnable, produced out of the effects of the late Mr. Ferdinand Cope of Rathangan, sold at public auction in Kildare Street in January last, and bought by His Grace the Duke of Kilcarrig for 11 shillings. My lord, that is the motive, and it is 420 guineas in one spring, and it is the reason my father was destroyed, and it was never about a grey mare at all. It was about the 2 mares on the same page. One of Nangle's counsel was on his feet. Lord Dunavane said, Sit down, sir. Honora Slaney said, I have one more. And she unlocked the deal box. She said, My lord, the mare Moonwater had a daughter, Silver Ash, foaled at Rathmoyne in 1808, who is standing in a paddock 11 miles from this room this morning. Silver Ash had a chestnut colt by the horse Cold Harbour on the 22nd of April, 1814, and Mr. Vesey sold that colt at Liverpool as a yearling for 40 guineas, because his pedigree could not be written, and wrote in his sale book beside the entry, God forgive me. I produced the foaling book of Rathmoyne for 1814. It is in the hand of Barnaby Vesey, and it was written within 1 hour of the foal being dropped, and it reads, Chestnut colt out of Silver Ash by Cold Harbour, star, off hind white to the fetlock, with a dark spot in the white above the joint, nigh 4 coronet white, large head. And I produced the certificate of Mr. Soden, veterinary surgeon of Malton in the county of York, taken in the spring of 1816 at the order of Mr. Everard Buick, of the horse now known as Ashen King. And Mr. Soden is here and will read it himself, and I ask that he read it without sight of the other, and that the stewards hold both. Mr. Soden read it. Star, white off hind to the fetlock, with 1 dark spot in the white above the joint. White coronet nigh 4. Large head. Lord Dunavane held the 2 papers, one in each hand, and looked at them for what felt to Honora like a very long time, and then he took off his spectacles and put them down on the table and said, in a voice quite unlike the one he had been using all morning, Sir Hesketh. Sir Hesketh Nangle did not stand up. He sat with his high color entirely gone and his hands on his knees, looking at nothing, and one of his counsel bent over him and spoke, and he did not answer, And then he said aloud to the room, in the small flat voice of a man who has stopped, the horse could not get a foal. That is all it was. He could not get a foal, and I had taken the money. And Lord Dunavane said, and Denise Slaney. And Sir Hesketh Nangle said. Denise Slaney wrote down what he saw. The stewards withdrew for 50 minutes. They came back, and Lord Dunavane read a finding of 11 lines, and Honora Slaney stood to hear it, with her hands folded in front of her, and her chin up, and could not afterwards remember one word of it except the 8th line, which was, and that the said minute of the 14th of June, 1811, be and is hereby rescinded and expunged, and that the name of Denise Slaney, Bloodstock Agent of Dublin, be restored to the register of authorist compilers, and that this finding be entered in the book and published in the sporting calendar, and that the mare Moonwater and the whole of her produce be admitted to the book from the year 1804. The finding was published on the Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon the price of every animal in Ireland with Rathmoyne blood in it had changed, and by Saturday there were men driving out to Rathmoyne to look over the rails at a herd of grey mares that 400 people had ridden past for 9 years without turning their heads. Mr. Gideon Thrale understood this faster than anybody, which was the one talent he had. On the Friday evening he entered 2 of the Kilcarrig foals for the September sales on the Curragh, held on the Saturday and Monday, and he did it by telegraph of the only kind that then existed, which was a man on a fast horse, and he got them into the catalogue as late lots on the Monday under the heading, the property of a nobleman, 2 foals by the celebrated horse Cold Harbour, the sire of Ashen King, out of first-class mares. He did not consult the Duke, who was at Rathmoyne. He did not consult anybody. He had been selling other people's horses for 29 years. The sale ring on the Curragh was a wooden rostrum under a tarpaulin with a rope walk round it and about 600 people standing in the mud. And the auctioneer on the Monday was Mr. Hubert Doone of Ship Street, Dublin, in a bottle green coat, with his glasses on his forehead and his hammer in his hand. And Honora Slaney had copied 900 pedigrees for that man for 11 shillings a week, and he had never once said her Christian name. She came up the rope walk at 2:20 in the afternoon with Mr. Eustace Prendergast on one side of her, and the Duke of Kilcarrig on the other, in the grey wool riding habit, with the leather deal box under her arm. The crowd made a lane for her. It did it without meaning to, the way crowds do, and Honora, who had spent her whole life going round the outside of gatherings, walked up the middle of one and found it did not kill her. Mr. Doone saw her coming from the rostrum, and his face did several things at once. She said, Mr. Doone, before you take lot 111. He said, Miss Slaney, and then, recovering, ma'am, and there was a small laugh somewhere at the back which died very quickly. She said, Lot 111 and Lot 112 are entered as the property of a nobleman. They are not. They are my property, and I have brought the book, and I would rather you read it out here than have it read in the forecourts in November. There was, by then, a silence over about 600 people in a muddy field. Mr. Doone said, ma'am, upon what? Honora Slaney opened the deal box and handed up 2 things, a certified copy of the will of Barnaby Vesey and the Rathmoyne Register, open at a page with a letter pasted into it. She said, read the clause, if you please, and then the page. And Mr. Hubert Doone, who was an auctioneer and therefore a professional reader of documents aloud, put his glasses down off his forehead and read, in the carrying voice that had sold 30,000 horses, and I direct that during the said term of 7 years the produce of every mare covered at Rathmoyne by the Rathmoyne horse shall be entered in the Rathmoyne Register, and shall stand to the account. of the mistress of Rathmoyne, save only where the fee for such covering has been paid in money at the time of service, and a receipt for the same entered in the said register over the signature of the mistress or her deputy. And I direct that no fee shall be forgiven, deferred, taken in kind, or entered on credit, and that any covering not so receipted shall be deemed a covering upon the account of Rathmoyne, and the produce thereof the absolute property of the mistress thereof. He stopped. He looked up. He said, "Ma'am, this is a stud farm's bookkeeping." She said, "It is. Read the page." He read the page, 9 lines in a beautiful clear hand, dated the 28th of May, 1819, each one giving a mare's name and her markings and the dates of her covering by the horse Cold Harbor, and each one ending in the same 6 words, no fee paid, no receipt given. And under them pasted in a letter in another hand entirely, dated the 14th of February, 1820, signed Gideon Thrale, agent, informing Miss Slaney for her book that his Grace's 9 mares from Kilkerrig were all in foal to the old horse, and had wintered well, and that he trusted the arrangement had been satisfactory on both sides, and that he would be obliged if she would confirm that no fee stood outstanding upon them. And under that, in the beautiful hand again, confirmed by the agent in writing, no fee paid, no receipt given. Mr. Prendergast stepped up onto the bottom board of the rostrum and said, in the dry voice of a man who has been waiting 19 months for a particular sentence, "I have advised my client, and I shall advise the court if I am asked, that the 9 foals dropped at Kilkerrig between the 2nd of March and the 11th of April last are, upon the plain construction of the clause, and upon the agent's own written admission, the absolute property of the mistress of Rathmoyne, and that lots 111 and 112 are accordingly not the vendor's to sell. It is right that I add that the markings of all 9 foals were furnished to Miss Slaney in writing, over his own signature, by the agent himself in April, upon a request made in the ordinary way of business. There is no question of identification. Somebody at the back of the crowd began to laugh and could not stop, and it went through 600 people in about 11 seconds, and Mr. Gideon Thrale, who had been standing by the rope with his hat in his hand and his face the color of a fish, turned round and began to walk away through the mud, and about 40 men turned to watch him go, and Mr. Hubert Doone brought his hammer down twice and said, "Lots 111 and 112 are withdrawn." And then the whole of that field turned and looked at the Duke of Kilkerrig. He was standing 3 feet from Honora Slaney with his hat under his arm, and he had just learned in public, along with 600 other people, that the entire young stock of his own stud, the 9 foals which were the only saleable thing he had left in the world, 2 of them already the subject of offers from England at 600 guineas apiece, belonged to a woman in a grey riding habit whom he had once described as not anything. Honora did not look at him. She had thought about this moment for 7 months, and she had never once been able to decide how it would go, and she stood there with her hands folded and waited to find out what she had done. The Duke of Kilkerrig began to laugh. He put his head back and laughed until he had to wipe his eyes with the back of his wrist, and 600 people watched him do it. And then he turned to her and said, loudly, so that the rope walk and the tarpaulin and the whole muddy field could hear him, "Miss Slaney, my agent has beggared me, and I could not be happier about it. And I hope you will observe that the fault is entirely mine, since I employed him for 11 years and never once read a page he wrote." And then he said, quieter and only to her, though a good many people heard it anyway, "You were right about the hedges. You were right about the strangles. You were right about the old horse when the whole county laughed at him, and you have been right about everything since the 5th of April in the year 19, and I have never in my life met anybody I would rather be beaten by." "Mr.," Doone said, into a silence. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, lot 113. It came out afterwards over the following 6 weeks in the way these things do. Mr. Gideon Thrale had taken a commission of 5 per centum from the estate on the private sale of 11 Rathmoyne mares to Sir Hesketh Nangle at prices averaging £38, and a further consideration from the buyer which he had entered in his own book as a loan and never repaid. He had taken the 9 Kilcarrig coverings on credit, not to save his master money, but because a covering fee paid in cash appears in an account and a covering fee taken on credit does not, and he had been doing the same thing with his master's property for 11 years in 14 different directions. The Duke of Kilcarrig dismissed him on the 20th of September in the estate office at Dunmoylan in the presence of 2 witnesses, and did not prosecute him, and afterwards said only that he had found he had no appetite for it, and that the man would be looking for a place for the rest of his life in a country where everybody now knew, and that this was worse. Sir Hesketh Nangle sold Ballycrana in the following March. He had to. The finding of the 14th of September went into the sporting calendar and out of the sporting calendar into every stud book in England, and 4 of the mares upon whom his whole reputation stood were re-entered as got by another man's horse. And 11 of the men who had bought from him at high prices for 8 years wrote to him within a month, and a person cannot sell blood in a trade that has stopped believing his book. He went to Bath. He never came back to Kildare. Honora Slaney did not go to the sale of his stud, though she was invited to it 4 times, and she bought nothing there. And when a man in Noss asked her why, she said, "Because I have what I wanted out of that house 11 years ago." And it was never a horse. The petition to set aside the will of Barnaby Vesey was withdrawn on the 11th of October, with costs. And Mr. Prendergast, who had waited 19 months to say something else, wrote to Honora that, in his professional opinion, the 3rd paragraph of it had been the most expensive sentence composed in Ireland that year. Mr. Everard Buick got his entry. Ashen King went into the book in the November supplement as a chestnut horse foaled in Ireland in 1814, by Cold Harbour out of Silver Ash, by Portreeve out of Moonwater, and he stood at Malton the following spring at 50 guineas a mare and filled his book in 9 days. And Mr. Buick sent Honora the 200 guineas he had advertised, together with a letter of 1 line which said, "Madam, I do not haggle, and 11 mares for the old horse at full fee paid in money at the time of service and receipted in the register," which he said, in a postscript he had read about and would not care to fall foul of. She spent the 200 guineas in 3 ways. She put a stone over her father in the burying ground at Kilmainham, a plain one, with his name and his years, and beneath them the words, "Denny Slaney," who wrote down what he saw. She had his book, the whole 11 volumes of it, copied fair and printed by subscription in Dublin in the spring of 1820, 400 copies, and there were 600 subscribers, and the stewards of the Turf Club took 11 of them. And she bought, for £41, the whole of Mr. Ambrose Keely's 49 bundles of day books when he died that winter at 82, and had them shelved in the office at Rathmoyne, because, as she told Mrs. Bracken, "There is not a stud in this country that will not one day need to know what a veterinary surgeon saw on a Tuesday in the year 99. Martin Cuffy came to Rathmoyne in November. She gave him the lodge at the gate, which had stood empty for 19 years, and £1 a week for the rest of his life, and a fire he did not have to buy turf for. And he kept that gate for 6 years and told everybody who came up the avenue, whether they wished to hear it or not, that he had stood up in the town hall at Naas and said it slow so the reporters could write it down. Fergus Dolan collected on his bet in September, at odds of 5-2, and would not say from whom, and was 74 that winter, and lived to see 3 crops of foals out of the grey mares. And on the 4th of October, 1820, Honora Slaney went into Naas and spent the whole of a day with Mr. Eustace Prendergast, and what she had drawn was 2 deeds. The first conveyed to Adair Ferrand, 6th Duke of Kilcarrig, absolutely and forever. The 9 foals dropped at Kilcarrig between the 2nd of March and the 11th of April in that year, together with all right and title of the mistress of Rathmoyne in the same, for a consideration of 1 shilling. The second was a deed of release. Mr. Prendergast had advised her upon it at some length, and his advice was that the condition attaching to the office of master of the Rathmoyne stud had been imposed by the testator solely for the benefit of the mistress of Rathmoyne, and that the person for whose benefit a condition is imposed may release it, and that a release under her hand and seal would extinguish the office entirely and leave the discharge of the mortgage standing and unimpeachable. So the second deed released His Grace the Duke of Kilcarrig from the said office and from every obligation attaching to it, from the 4th day of October, 1820, absolutely, forever, and without condition of any kind. She sent them both to Dunmoylan by a boy on a pony at 4 in the afternoon, and then went out and mucked out 3 boxes she had no business mucking out, and Mrs. Bracken watched her from the kitchen window and said nothing at all to anybody. He came at 7. It was nearly dark, and there was a wind getting up off the Curragh, and she was standing at the rail of the front paddock in her old grey habit with no lantern, exactly where she had stood on the first night, and the grey mare Silver Ash had put her long bony head over the top rail and left it there. Honora heard him come up the grass and did not turn round. He said, "Miss Slaney." "What is this?" She said, "It is 9 foals and a release." He said, "I can read." "Why?" and Honora Slaney said to the dark, with her hand flat on a mare's cheekbone, "Because I have been thinking about it since the 16th of September, and it comes to this. You have been bound to me by a piece of paper since the day you first saw me. Every hour you have given this place, every night in that loft, every horse you sold in Dublin to pay a lawyer, every kind thing you have said to me in a yard, has been said by a man who would have gone under the hammer if he had stopped saying them. And I have found that I cannot live the rest of my life without knowing which of it was the paper and which of it was you. So there is no paper now. The debt is gone and it cannot come back, and the office is gone, and the foals are yours, and they are worth £4,000 if they are worth a penny, and you may sell them and mend the roof of the long gallery and never come up this avenue again as long as you live, and nothing whatever will happen to you. That is what it is." There was a long silence, and the wind went through the beeches. Then the Duke of Kilcarrig said, "And if I do come up the avenue?" She said, "Then I shall know." He said, "Honora, it was the first time." She turned round. He said, "I have had those 2 deeds in my hand since 4:30, and I have read them 9 times. And do you know what I did with them?" She said, "No." He said, "I put them in the estate box, and I locked it, and then I stood in the middle of my own hall, which has no pictures in it, and no plate, and no carpet, and I thought, she has just made me a free man, and the first free thing I am going to do is ride 21 miles in the dark and ask her something I have not been allowed to ask for 18 months. And then he said, "Will you marry me?" And Honora Slaney, 24 when she came up that avenue on the box of a turf cart with 2 pounds 6 sewn into her petticoat, and 25 now, said yes. And then said, "I ought to tell you that I shall want to go on keeping the book myself." And he said, "God help the man who tried to take it off you." And then neither of them said anything at all for some time, and the gray mare, finding herself no longer attended to, went away down the field in the dark. They were married at Clonamore on the 11th of April, 1821, at 9 in the morning, because there were 4 mares due to foal that week, and Honora would not go further from the yard than a mile. There were 31 people in the church. Mrs. Una Bracken cried from the first word to the last. Fergus Dolan gave her away, in the collar that strangled him, and Mr. Everard Buick came from Yorkshire with his wife, and stood at the back and blew his nose like a trumpet, and Mr. Eustace Prendergast read the register with his spectacles pushed up into his hair, and Martin Cuff walked up from the lodge and stood at the door, because he said he would be more comfortable there, and Mr. Hubert Doone of Ship Street, Dublin, who had been invited and had not expected to be, sat in the 4th pew, and told everybody afterwards that he had known from the first week that the girl had the best hand and the best head in Ireland, which was true in one particular and a lie in every other, and which she forgave him for. She was styled, from that day, Her Grace the Duchess of Kilkerrig. She was called by every man in the county of Kildare who had anything to do with horses, and to the end of her life, the mistress of Rathmoyne. Bright Ash ran for the first time on the Curragh in the October of 1821. A grey 3-year-old filly out of Silver Ash by Cold Harbour, full sister to Ashen King, and she won by 4 lengths going away. And the crowd came off the rail and ran with her the last furlong the way Irish crowds do, and Honora stood on the step of the weighing room with her hand over her mouth, and her husband's arm around her shoulders, and could not see any of it for about a minute and a half. Rathmoyne stood 4 stallions by the year 1830, and covered 211 mares a season. And the roof of the long gallery at Kilkerrig was mended in the summer of 22. And there were 4 children, and the eldest of them was a girl who could name every mare in the middle paddock by the time she was 6 years old, because her mother taught her the way her mother had been taught, at a kitchen table, with a quill cut short. The Rathmoyne Register ran to 19 volumes. Every one of them had the same 3 lines on the title page, in the same beautiful hand, and the last of them was written in 1861 by a woman of 66 with spectacles on, the Rathmoyne Register, kept by the mistress thereof. Nothing is entered here that is not proved. And the broken shutter on the hatch between the office and the tack room at Rathmoyne was never mended, not in her lifetime nor in her daughter's, and when men asked about it, as men did for 40 years, the mistress of Rathmoyne would say only that it was there, so that whoever kept the book could hear the yard, and that she had found, once, that it was worth a very great deal more than it cost, and she would say nothing else about it at all.